Okay, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the treatment approach to COVID-19 in various hospital supply, bed supply, personal protective gear supply, etc. First, I'd like to address the hospital bed shortages. It is made to seem that the federal government is responsible for hospital bed shortages, not providing them with enough equipment, etc. But in reality, each individual state has a process that hospitals go through to add beds. It's called the CON process, or a Certificate of Need process. Each state is individually required or requires hospitals to go through that process before they can add beds. Usually that means 80 to 85% occupancy rate of existing beds before you can add any new beds. And then once you decide to add new beds, then those are usually challenged by other hospital systems that don't want you to have new beds. I think this is an archaic process that has occurred from the time of the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was the 1920s or 30s when this originally began. And instead of letting generalized market forces determining whether or not hospital beds are required or needed, and subsequently resulting in potentially reduced cost for hospitalization, you have hospital beds controlled by a very limited number of hospitals or business entities. And they are aided in fact by the Certificate of Need process that the individual states go through. So from that standpoint, each individual state is responsible for their number of hospital beds and whether or not they have adequate or inadequate beds. So it would be nice if the governors would admit that and say, okay, this is our process that we've gone through and we made mistakes by not allowing enough even potential overflow beds to be built in case the need arise. And usually this is a chasing your tail type situation, in which case patients start getting stuck in the ER in beds and sometimes in the hallway in beds before new hospital beds are able to be built as they go through this whole prolonged process of building new beds. The second thing I'd like to mention is that there are 4,000 ambulatory surgery centers, or roughly 4,000 centers in the United States of America. And that's as of 2016, I believe. Each of these ambulatory surgery centers has beds available that usually have oxygen, appropriate electrical outlets, beds. They may or may not have adequate number of ventilators, but they do have other processes that are present. They have medical staff to staff these beds, and they would have to be adjusted, obviously, for doing 24-hour monitoring as opposed to their daytime monitoring, which is usually less than 24 hours, to get patients in and out in order to be an ambulatory surgery center. But they have the infrastructure in place to go ahead and provide fairly readily accessible beds if we go ahead and stop the ambulatory surgery center procedures and convert them to bed use for non-critical patients from the hospitals. And that would be easily doable. There's some small logistical factors, but certainly not any more so than setting up these temporary field hospitals and whatnot. But you'd have to have adequate pharmacies and obviously food to be brought in and whatnot. But they do have most everything else that is necessary for taking care of patients. So these could be essentially commandeered under the Defense Authorization Act and directed into this mode of providing care and they could be paid for taking care of the hospital patients, obviously. So I think New York State has 179 ambulatory surgery centers. My estimate is that there are at least 20 beds for each ambulatory surgery center that are able to be used. So nationwide, you're talking about 80,000 additional beds that are relatively easily accessible. California has a lot of them. Florida has a lot of them, and various other states have a fair number of them as well. So I think that would help with the bed shortages that we are going to experience or are experiencing currently without involving a whole lot of essential drama involved in putting up field hospitals, converting dorms or whatever else into bed care stations. Now, as I look at the various potential treatments, obviously we're all hopeful that the current batch of vaccines that are being worked on for various drug companies are actually going to be functional and will actually work. The Plaquenil, or the malarial drug, along with zithromycin, appears to be very promising. I admit there are small studies, but the largest study was in France, where they had 80 patients who were in significant dire straits treated with that combination, and it resulted in 79 of the 80 patients surviving, which was a far improvement over roughly 12 to 15% of people who end up getting significantly sick and are hospitalized in that kind of situation, usually dying. And the person who did die was like 91 years old with a much greater number of comorbid factors. And almost all of the patients that do die do have comorbid factors. Diabetes seems to be a big part of it, or other chronic medical conditions. Again, we'll know more once all the studies are out, but I think that that's a promising drug that needs to be certainly used. And there's a lot of hesitancy on various people. Oh, we don't know how safe it is and whatnot. These are sick patients, yes, but your choice is having a 12 to 20% chance of dying versus a significant chance of living. I think that any risks associated with the drugs are minimal. I do caution that there are a large number of prescribers in the United States of America, both physicians, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, that can prescribe medications. And I am hoping that other physicians and medical personnel like myself will look at those drugs and realize that these are to be used on the significantly sick population and not prescribe them in a prophylactic measure for their family members, that if they get sick, they will have the drugs to take. Because that essentially will result in people dying who really need the drugs. Because I think there was an estimate that we currently have in stock, roughly 2.3 million doses. The last figure I heard of the Plaquenil available if it was used for the treatment of the COVID-19. So it's a fairly limited number of potential treatments. So if every physician, nurse practitioner, and PA decided, well, I'm going to have some for myself, for my family, you would wipe out that dose very quickly. And I guess India has basically stated that, well, we're producing this and we're going to save it for our own people. So we really need to get our current drug manufacturers into the loop to go ahead and produce more of the drug, because I think that right now it is probably the best option that's available to people who are significantly ill with the disease in order to keep them alive. And obviously live people are better than non-live people. So in a way, I am a little bit disappointed from the standpoint of hospital systems not having an adequate disaster preparedness plan that would actually stockpile 3 months worth of personal protective gear for the patient if everyone was seen with universal precautions. I think that in the future we should be looking at a change so that they do have a minimum, or are required to have a minimum of a 3-month supply. Unfortunately, everybody has gotten into the same venue of Walmart and other businesses that your required supply is just a phone call and 24 hours away. And that means that if you get an interruption in the supply chain, it obviously creates an interruption in your ability to act on that 24-hour turnaround time of supply. And I knew in the past that this was an issue with regards to defense items, such as certain circuit boards, etc., as well as steel and aluminum, and that's why I applauded President Trump on his attempt to protect steel and aluminum production plants in this nation. If you are involved in any kind of conflict and you do not have the ability to produce steel or aluminum, you are going to be in a situation where you are going to lose. If you look at past wars, World War I, World War II, a lot of the production capability came down to how much steel can you actually produce in order to actually fight a war. Now there's a lot of aluminum in aircraft, etc., that are required. So certain defense-specific industries, I think, need support and protection in order to maintain them in the United States, whether it be building ships, building aircraft, building the engines and the systems that power them and the subsystems. I don't particularly care for the Joint Strike Fighter because all of their subsystems and parts are spread out amongst such a wide variety of locations that interruption of supply from any of those locations could result in lack of maintenance of flyability of the Joint Strike Fighter. And now with this COVID-19 crisis, we actually talk about medications. The pharmacy companies are allowed to have their active ingredients produced overseas, and then they're brought back to the United States for compounding and final assembly of product, such as pills, capsules, etc., where they're met with fillers and whatnot. So we have lost our ability to go ahead and produce active ingredients for pharmaceutical medications, and that's where our big problem arises. When I was in the hospital, we had significant shortages of various drugs, radioisotopes, and we had that disastrous issue with heparin, where the concentration of the heparin was far stronger than it was supposed to be, and that all essentially can be led back to China and the manufacture of those agents and lack of production capability, etc., that results in us having constant shortages. Prior to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the degree that you would get an agent or a drug that was a shortage was extremely rare in a hospital system. And now it's a commonplace occurrence. So obviously, anything to bring back medication manufacturing to this country is important. Personal protective gear manufacturing is important. And as a result of all that, I have looked at and discussed with various people what is the economic feasibility of looking at a consumption-based placement of manufacturing facilities. For example, U.S. in general consumes 25% of the world's output. I think that if you consume more than 5 or 7.5% of a specific item, that same percentage of manufacturing capability and or jobs should belong to the country where they are consumed. And whether or not that be France, Germany, China, Europe, the United States, whatever, it would help distribute the manufacturing capabilities throughout the world and help maintain critical skill sets that are necessary in order to maintain manufacturing capabilities of a wide range of products. And yes, I understand it would be somewhat more expensive, but we're not talking about the entirety of the manufacturing capability of a company being located solely in the United States. But if we consume 25% of a company's output, then we should have 25% of that manufacturing capability here in the United States, with 25% of the jobs belonging to U.S. citizens. That's my general overall economic view of a way to fix or improve the product or the process that is currently ongoing in the world, where we are at a severe disadvantage if somebody decides they don't like us and they are the sole supplier or one of the main sole suppliers or 90% supplier of a particular good. We're out of luck, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's like India deciding they want to go ahead and keep as much Plaquenil for themselves as possible. Well, they're theoretically an ally, and now we're out of luck because they've decided, well, we've got 1.3 billion people, so we're going to need it more than you do. And again, everybody will protect their own. So if we do a distributed manufacturing capability, then the likelihood is that we will always have the ability to manufacture what we need and what we consume, and that the degree of shortages will be vastly limited. And we'll preserve jobs and preserve technical competence in manufacturing certain items. Thank you very much for listening, and I will be posting more videos in the future if anybody is interested in listening to them. Thank you.